Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening. Khosh Omadid. Thank you very much for joining us today for our Alireza Ahmadian Lecture series. I would like to begin our session today by acknowledging that the land on which I speak from today, and which is also the land that UBC is located on, is the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And since today is March 8th, I would also like to acknowledge that today is International Women's Day, and which marks a global day of celebration of the achievements of women, be it social, economic, cultural, or political. And the day also marks a call to action for accelerating women's equality worldwide. A quick note on the Alireza Ahmadian lecture series, in case you are a new guest here. Alireza Ahmadian was an enthusiastic researcher, a socio-political analyst, and an opinion leader on foreign policy. And he was also a proud and devoted UBC alumnus, a supporter of our department, the UBC's Department of Asian Studies, and a beloved member of the Iranian Canadian community. The department renamed this lecture series in his honor in 2019. So today we will hear a talk entitled Translating Persian, Universalizing Islam, the Case of Rumi's Moses and the Shepherd. Our speaker today is Austin O'Malley, and our discussant is Francesca Chubb-Confer. But before I introduce them a bit more thoroughly, I would like to thank the behind-the-scenes team today, which is Tiffany, Fatima, and as well Razman for the poster designs. And of course, I would also like to thank my co-organizers, Dr. Navina Nakvi and Dr. Mustafa Abedini Fad. Okay, so now I have the pleasure of introducing two of my dear colleagues from Chicago, actually. Our speaker today, Austin O'Malley, is an assistant professor of Persian literature at the University of Chicago, where he did his BA and PhD, and where he now also teaches. And his monograph, The Poetics of Spiritual Instruction, Farid ad-Din Attar, and Persian Sufi Didacticism, was published by Edinburgh University Press in 2023. Today's discussant, Francesca Chubb-Confer, is a visiting assistant professor of religion at Oberlin College and Conservatory. Her current book project focuses on Muhammad Iqbal, the early 20th century reformer, philosopher, and poet. And the book also analyzes how the relationship between form and content in his work navigates between the classical Islamic tradition and the demands of colonial modernity. Francesca's published work has appeared in the International Journal of Islam in Asia, Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, and Afghanistan. So thank you very much for the two of you for joining us today. I'm very excited about the talk and the following discussion afterwards. And so with that, I would like to invite you, Austin, to begin your presentation. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for that introduction. And thanks to all of you for attending today and what I'm sure is a lovely afternoon in British Columbia. And it's really a great honor to be able to speak to you all today. So I'm going to start just by sharing my screen here first. All right. So today I'm going to be talking about Rumi's Masnavi, which I consider it to be an example of great example of world literature. And part of what makes it so great and makes it such a unique and special text is the ways in which that it sort of resists certain kinds of interpretive frameworks that we often put on it. And I think this is the mark of like a really great piece of writing, actually, is that it's not sort of pattern conforming, but it's pattern breaking. And its complexity resists sort of simple explanations. Now, the Masnavi, of course, is, I think it's probably one of the most popular works of Sufi literature in the United States and in Europe that's been translated into English. And it means a lot of things to a lot of different people, but often we sort of understand it as a sort of mystical work or a work of sort of spirituality. And in some sense it is, but there's also a way in which the notion of the mystical is a rather, comes with some baggage, let's say, and is a framework informed by certain assumptions that don't always fit comfortably with a pre-modern Sufi text. Nevertheless, those assumptions have framed how the text has been translated and received. But a careful reading of the text sort of problematizes those assumptions and sort of shows those truncations that have been made. And I think we can learn a lot about that. We can learn more about the Masnavi on its own terms, and by sort of unsettling some of our expectations, we can learn more about ourselves and our own assumptions and our own expectations that we might be bringing to the text. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And I wanted to start by just briefly talking a bit about sort of this notion of mysticism. And of course, it's a word that's derived from the Greek, but it's not really used as an English abstract noun. It's actually not used in the Greek really until the modern period either. But it becomes a sort of abstract noun in English in the 17th century, and it refers to a kind of, when it first appears, a sort of exorbitant, extravagant, sort of unrestrained religiosity that's seen as sort of at odds with European Enlightenment norms of rationality and restraint and decorum. Sometimes it's gendered sort of feminine. And over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, though, it gains a more positive valence, I would say, in certain circles, as a kind of inner orientation towards God, a sort of inner, individual, experiential kind of encounter with the divine. And it's different sort of groups of people who are doing this, but Unitarians, transcendentalists in the American context are involved in this. And it sort of breaks through maybe into the mainstream, let's say, with the work of William James, who's a very famous psychologist and thinker. In some ways, he's sort of one of the founders, I would say, of modern religious studies. And he gives a series of important lectures around the turn of the century that then become published papers on the varieties of religious experience today. And what James postulates is that, again, he sees sort of mysticism as this individual encounter, a sort of subjective experience of sort of losing oneself in God, losing oneself in the divine. And he sees it as the sort of animating core at the center of every religion. So every religion sort of has this mystical core, and the other kinds of things that we think about when we think about religion, like metaphysics or rituals or practices or institutions, these are all sort of derivative. This is the sort of essential thing that animates human religious phenomena. And he's quite explicit about this. So he writes at one point that this overcoming of all the usual barriers between the individual and the absolute is the great mystic achievement. In mystic states, we both become one with the absolute, and we become aware of our oneness. This is the everlasting and triumphant mystical tradition, hardly altered by differences of clime or creed. in Hinduism, in Neoplatonism, in Sufism, in Christian mysticism, in Whitmanism, we find the same recurring note, so that there is about mystical utterances an internal unanimity, which ought to make a critic stop and think. So by sort of emphasizing this sort of internal subjective experience of God, which can't really be measured, right? And downplaying these sort of external, exoteric manifestations of religious difference, he sort of suggests that all religions at their core really have something very fundamental in common with one another. And this was a popular idea that I think spoke to people's needs at the time. It gave a way for religious liberals in Europe and the United States to think about and take seriously the diversity of religious traditions without relinquishing their own sort of feeling that religious experience was important and fundamental to humankind in a universal kind of way. I think also one of the things it did is that it, by emphasizing sort of inner experience as the heart of religious experience, it gave a kind of core that was protected from disenchantment by modern science, right? If sort of mythology and metaphysics, ethics, and these kinds of things are sort of derivative to this sort of inner phenomenological experience of God, then, you know, things like modern astronomy and I don't know, evolution, right? These are sort of less of a threat, right? Because they're not going to sort of change how one feels. They might sort of knock down ideas about humans came about or the creation of the world, but they're not going to, so the theory would go, sort of change the sense of awe one might have. And this continues to be important today. You know, this kind of thinking really resonates. In some ways, the sort of, if James posited a sort of mystical core at the heart of every religion, now it's no longer the core of a religion, but it's sort of something that operates outside and above it. It's very common these days to talk about being spiritual but not religious. And what people mean when they say spiritual is usually, in many ways, goes back to what sort of James's ideas about mysticism are, right? It's a sort of inner orientation towards God, and that's seen as more meaningful and more significant than sort of being part of an institution or part of the sort of traditional social relationships that might go along with, you know, a traditional religion. So that's fine, you know, that's great. And it's important for a lot of people. I think one of the issues, though, with this notion of mysticism is that it can be sort of anachronistic if one tries to apply it, particularly to the pre-modern period or Sufism in this case. Right? To be sure, there's things in Sufism that very much are about inner experience. There's this idea that you know, if one performs sima, for instance, one might experience vajt or ecstasy. There's the idea that one should, or may be sort of blessed with an experience of fina, or sort of annihilation or losing oneself in God, which is quite similar to what James says when he talks about the, you know, the overcoming of all the usual barriers between the individual and the absolute. I think the difference is in that in, you know, pre-modern Sufism, these kinds of inner experiences are very much enmeshed in relationships of spiritual guidance between sort of the sheikh and the murid. And for the vast majority of Sufis, also living in accordance with the Sharia is sort of a prerequisite to experiencing these things, right? Living as part of a Muslim community is a prerequisite to experiencing these things. So it doesn't have the same sort of individualizing maybe tendency that we see in modern notions of mysticism, which in many ways are sort of surreptitiously Protestant. I'll talk about that in a moment. Another issue is that most Sufis, you know, they wouldn't see themselves as sort of necessarily having very much in common with people of other religions. I think that They would see themselves as first and foremost Muslims, maybe the Muslims par excellence, and not as participants in a sort of universal kind of mysticism that can be divorced from Islam, for instance. Nevertheless, these sorts of ideas have really influenced how we think about Sufism. And I think because of the influence of modern notions of mysticism, we go back, when some of the various early writing on Sufis, for instance, suggest that they're not really Muslim, that this is something else, something separate than Islam. Actually, this goes back to the very earliest English language treatise on Sufism, which is written in 1811. So it's actually a century before James, by one Lieutenant James William Graham. That should be a J there, not a G. James, and he's part of the British military colonial administration in India. And this is, Carl Ernst discusses this in his book, The Shambhala Guide to Sufism. That's where I first learned about this text. It's really very interesting. And he starts out by saying this, with regard to the religion, if it can be so termed in the general acceptation of that word, or rather doctrine and tenets of the sect of the Sufis, it is requisite to observe, first, that any person or a person of any religion or sect may be a Sufi. So this is sort of something he sets out as a postulate at the beginning. And again, this would, as I hope to show in this presentation, be very strange for someone like Rumi. But it's really influenced how people were talking about Sufism, certainly in academic circles up to maybe the middle or third quarter of the 20th century, and still in popular circles, I think. It's not only this idea that Sufis are not sort of Muslim, but also this notion of mysticism as a sort of interiorizing orientation, sort of internal orientation towards God. Although it purports to be sort of universal, in many ways sort of smuggles in certain kinds of Protestant notions of religion, right? The idea that it's a sort of individual, interior kind of experience. Of course, in Protestantism, one is saved by faith alone, right? By acknowledging Jesus Christ as one's savior. It's not about being part of an institution or even necessarily, receiving a sacrament or particular works or particular deeds, right? It's about faith. It's about this sort of interior sort of outlook that one has. And I think one sees that in James's emphasis on this sort of individual interior experience of God. So this idea of mysticism, James's mysticism, is presented as sort of trans-religious or super-religious even. It's presented as a sort of universal framework for understanding mysticism across religions. But in fact, it's taking a very particular kind of Protestant understanding of religion and sort of presenting it as universal. And because of that, it's really interesting. Sufis in particular have been presented as sort of crypto-Protestants or crypto-Christians even throughout the history of sort of Western scholarship of Sufism. So sometimes this takes the form of suggesting that Sufis, they're sort of said to be the Christians to Orthodox Islam's Judaism. So actually, Graham in this treatise that I have here, as he continues, he will quote the Apostle Paul a lot about how the law has been sort of fulfilled by Jesus, and suggesting that just as sort of Christians come and say that Jesus has fulfilled the law, it's no longer necessary to follow the Jewish law. So too, Sufis are saying something similar to Orthodox Islam, saying that it's not important to follow the Sharia. And of course, there are some Sufis who have said such things, or maybe appear to be suggesting that one transgressed the religious law. But for the 95% throughout history, that has not been the case, and it's certainly not the case with Rumi. Even though they may suggest that there's a sort of inner spirit to the law that is more important than just the external observance. One needs the external observance to get to that inner spirit. Another great example of this is from a edition, a collection of different translations of Omar Khayyam's quatrains by Robert Arnault. This is also from the beginning of the 20th century. And Arnault sees Khayyam as a Sufi, which is not how I recommend seeing him. But he sees him as a Sufi, and he sees him as having a special connection to Luther, actually, of all people. So you can see he ends his introduction by saying, I can find no better yokefellow for him, the Sufistic Khayyam, than Luther, like whom he was indeed an apostle of protest. So it's a bit surprising when one reads that now, but this is really all over sort of early treatments of Sufism, that it's a kind of sort of has a special affinity to Protestantism in particular. And sometimes this can be quite racialized. And you'll find the suggestion that Sufism is somehow more Persian or perhaps indebted to Indic influences, or it's Aryan, as opposed to Orthodox Islam's sort of inherently Semitic and thus sort of rule-bound outlook. And you'll see this even in James. So James says, in the Mohammedan world, the Sufi sect and various dervish bodies are the possessors of the mystical tradition. The Sufis have existed in Persia from the earliest times, and as their pantheism is so at variance with the hot and rigid monotheism of the Arab mind, it has been suggested that Sufism must have been inoculated into Islam by Hindu influences, right? So the idea again is that Sufism is something foreign to Islam. It has an origin in sort of Indo-European or Indo-Aryan, as they might term it, traditions. It's sort of this vital kind of interior individual kind of outlook that is at odds with what he calls the hot and rigid monotheism of the Arab mind. Yeah, I mean, this is actually pretty tame, actually, in how it's being expressed. You'll find it in much stronger language. And of course, it's not historically correct by any means. I mean, the idea to find roots of Sufism in India is really, there's just no evidence for it. And the idea that there's some sort of special affinity among Iranians for Sufism isn't really correct either. Sufism, by all accounts, begins with Arab thinkers, and it's first articulated in Arabic, of course. And Sufism is always just as important in Damascus and Cairo and Marrakesh as it is in Herat and Nishapur. And I don't think anyone's going to, hopefully say something like this today, at least in academic circles. But these kinds of ideas nonetheless still have influence on how Sufism is understood in Europe and the United States and Canada and English-speaking contexts, as does this idea that Sufism is sort of something separate from Islam. And one of the things I want to do sort of today in the time that remains is I want to show how these ideas have shaped how Rumi has been sort of understood and translated and accepted in sort of Anglo-speaking contexts over the last 120 years. In many ways, he's been translated, I think, to sort of fulfill these expectations, to match this idea of a sort of universalizing mysticism. But if you pay close attention to the Persian text, or a sort of more accurate translation from the Persian, there's a lot of things in there that complicate that picture and complicate this framework. And I find it very productive to sort of do that. One of the first translations, and I should say that the way I'm going to do this today is I'm going to focus on one story in particular from Rumi's Masnavi, and that's the story of the Moses and the shepherd. And this is I think, probably the most well-known story from the Masnavi in these Anglo-speaking contexts. And part of that reason is because it seems at first reading to really fit very well, actually, into this sort of framework of mysticism as a kind of super religious, universal kind of impulse. And seems to sort of emphasize interior orientation over all other things. But if you pay close attention to the story, I think it actually, there's the suggestion that things are more complicated than that. So it's this, for those of you who don't know, the story goes like this. So Moses, who of course is well known as a sort of lawgiver and also an overturner of idols, right? The golden calf. He's out one day in the wilderness and he hears a shepherd singing a sort of song to God, a song of devotion. And the shepherd is saying, "Oh God, I wish I'd love to just comb your hair for you out of devotion for you. I'd love to pick the lice out of your hair. I'd love to sweep your bed out for you, make your little comfy bed and rub your little feet for you, bring you warm milk to make sure you're all comfortable before sleeping." And Moses hears this and he's just aghast, right? He says, this is rank anthropomorphism. This is how you might talk to your uncle or your aunt, but it's not how you talk to the Lord of the two worlds. Put a sock in it, you foolish shepherd, before your infidelity and anthropomorphism brings down the wrath of God and gets us all killed. And the shepherd is really dejected when he hears this. And, he's very heartbroken. He goes out into the desert. But then Moses himself gets a revelation from God. And just as Moses had rebuked the shepherd, now Moses is rebuked by God. And God says, "You're a prophet, Moses. It's your job to drive people away from me or to bring people towards me. This shepherd is one of the sort of special lovers of me. His heart is burnt with love for me. And it's really unfair of you to sort of castigate him for that. We should sort of overlook this theologically infelicitous terminology he uses because he's the sincere lover of me. And I look to people's hearts and what's in their hearts, and I don't look to their expressions or what they say." And of course, this in some ways is very much in line with this sort of understanding of mysticism that I was talking about, right? That it's about an interior orientation towards God. It's not about sort of external manifestations of it in language or practice or institutions or things like that. And it very much sort of maps onto also sort of Protestant ideas about sort of personal devotion, individual submission to God more than, and knowing theological issues, let's say. But then there's a third act of the story. And the third act is that Moses, after being rebuked by God, goes and finds the shepherd and apologizes to him and says, I've been rebuked by God. You can say whatever you want. And the way Rumi puts it, it almost sounds to me like Moses is a little bit peeved by this. Like he says, it turns out infidelity is now faith and faith is infidelity, and you can say whatever you want. So go ahead. But the shepherd says, no, you don't have to apologize. Thank you for chastising me. Actually, your chastisement was like a whiplash against the horse that I was mounted on, and it sort of propelled me on the spiritual journey up through the spheres. So actually, blessings be upon you that you've chastised me, because I'm now neither here nor there, and I'm in this sort of ineffable mystical state thanks to your rebuke. So it's clear that Moses was too harsh on the shepherd, and an authority no less than God himself rebukes him for that. But at the same time, the shepherd sort of thanks Moses for what he's done, and the shepherd wouldn't get to the spiritual state he eventually gets to if it hadn't been for Moses's rebuke. So I think it's a really interesting complication of the story. And there's a lot to be sort of said about it and to think about it and to dwell on it. But what's really interesting to me is the ways in which this complicating climax is lost or actually elided and not translated in several of the English translations we have. And also it really hasn't been taken up in sort of the cultural imaginary of English readers of the Masnavi. So the first translation we have of a big chunk of the Masnavi is this one by Winfield. And he's also of sort of British colonial service, the Bengal Civil Service. He's a lawyer and an amateur Orientalist. He does a translation of Khayyam as well. And he translates a kind of abridgment of the Masnavi that is in verse and then also has some prose summary. And he gives a prose summary of how Moses rebukes the shepherd, and then a verse translation of how God rebukes Moses. But then you can see these ellipses here. That's where Moses goes and apologizes to the shepherd, and the shepherd says, "Don't worry about it. I'm actually thankful you rebuked me." So that's all just sort of elided under those few ellipses. So a lot is being left out there. And also in more sort of modern and scholarly translations, we see this too. So in the translation of my teacher, the late great Franklin Lewis, he also translates this story, and he also translates the sort of first two acts, Moses's rebuke of the shepherd and then God's rebuke of Moses, but he puts the sort of what I would consider the climax of the story, the third act, in the notes of his translation where he explains it. Some people do translate it, and we'll see some examples of that at the end of the talk. But I think sort of in general, the sort of sense of this story, insofar as it's made its way into sort of English language, sort of spiritual circles, tends to leave this climax out. So if you go to the Wikipedia page on Moses and the shepherd, at least as of yesterday or 2 days ago, it just has the first two parts that I've told you. It doesn't have doesn't mention the shepherd sort of thanking Moses for his rebuke. Maybe someone can go and change Wikipedia now and talk. But it's been this way for the past 2 or 3 years. And it's not just in English either, but also in, I think, in Persian language discourse as well. So there was an ethnography of women's sort of spiritual poetry circles in Iran that came out a couple of years ago by Professor Niloufar Ha'iri. And she sort of went to these different kinds of reading groups where Iranian women would read sort of spiritual poetry. And she uses actually the story of Moses and the shepherd as sort of a frame for the book. And even the title, "Say What Your Longing Heart Desires," is taken from this story. It's what Moses tells the shepherd after he's been rebuked by God, that, you know, God says you can say whatever you want, say whatever your longing heart desires. Harche michohet deletenget begu. But what's even interesting here is that Professor Ha'iri also doesn't mention the sort of third climactic act of this story. So she presents it as kind of emblematic of this sort of Irfan mystical worldview that for the women participating in these literary circles is a way to sort of Islamically, a kind of mode of Islamic piety that is seen as sort of opposed to the state-sanctioned 12-hour Shiism of the Islamic Republic. And I don't know if it was just her framework, or if maybe the sessions she was attending, if the participants were working from incomplete texts, or maybe they had the complete text, but they were just not interested in the final climactic episode. They were interested in the first two, but that's all that she reports on in her ethnography. And I think what this shows is that, this is not just an issue of language, but I think the sort of modern, sort of universalizing notion of mysticism, which is sort of surreptitiously Protestantizing, is really widespread. It's really a global thing now, right? And if you end the story with Moses being rebuked by God and God saying, however anyone speaks to me, that's fine. What's important to me is just what's in their heart. That sort of accords with that framework much more easily and much more nicely. But once you actually get the shepherd sort of say, no, it's good you rebuked me, that complicates it. It doesn't fit so easily with it. So there's a tendency to sort of drop it in modern receptions of the story. It's not only this third act, though, I would say that sort of complicates the modern understanding of mysticism, but also Rumi's language throughout it. So I want to look at some of the Persian, and just a second here, I need to rearrange the windows on my screen. So this is from God's rebuke of Moses. And I'm going to read the Persian for you, although I'm going to start at the third line because the first two are obscured on my screen, but hopefully you can see that. And he writes, To beroye vasl kardan amedi, ya beroye fasl kardan amedi, ta tevani pa manah andar firaq, abqaz al-ashyai andi itlaq. هر کسی را سیرتی بنهادم هر کسی را اصطلاحی دادم در حق او مهد و در حق تو زن در حق تو شهد و در حق تو سم ما بری از پاک و ناپاکی همه از گرانجانی و چالاکی همه من نکردم امر تا سودی کنم بلکه تا بر بندگان جودی کنم هندوان را اصطلاح هند مد سندیان را اصطلاح سند مد من نگردم پاک از تسبیحشان پاک همیشان شوند و دورفشان ما زبان را ننگریم و قال را ما روان را بنگریم و حال را ناظر قلبیم اگر خاشه بود گرچه گفته لفظ ناخوازه بود. So in English, a revelation came to Moses from God. You have separated our servant from us. Have you come to unify or have you come to divide? The most repugnant of things to me is divorce. I have laid a way for everyone. I have given a terminology to everyone. What is praise for him is base for you. What is honey for him is poison for you. We are above any purity or pollution, any enthusiasm or apathy. I have not given commands to profit, but to be generous to my servants. The Indians praise in the terminology of India. The Sindhis praise in terminology of Sind. I am not purified by their praise. Rather, they become pure through those pearls. We don't look to the tongue or to speech, but to the heart when it is humble. I'm also going to let you read the final line on your own because that's also obscured by some of the icons on my screen here. But what I want to point out is that there's a lot in here that does resonate with this sort of universalizing idea of mysticism and sort of super religious. There's a lot in here that resonates with, I think, the kind of very Protestant idea of inner orientation being more important than external form. Things like we consider the heart when it's humble, even if the speech comes out rough, or we don't look to the tongue or speech, but to the heart and its state. But at the same time, an argument is being made here for that sort of privileging of inner orientation in very Islamic terms, right? And calling on and using as evidence what we might call the sort of exoteric Islamic sciences and things like Hadith and Quran. So Rumi actually cites a Arabic Hadith here, right? أبغض الأشياء عندي الطلاق. Changes it a little bit from the meter, but it is in Arabic. The most repugnant of things to me is divorce. This is something the Prophet allegedly said. There is also another hadith which is being cited a little bit more indirectly, and it's this final line here. We consider the heart when actually the final two lines. We don't look to the heart or speech. We don't look to the tongue or speech, but to the heart and its state. And this is a sort of Persian reworking of this Arabic hadith here, right? Inna Allah la yandaru illa sawarikum wa amwalikum walakin yandaru illa qulubikum, right? So truly God does not look to your forms or to your possessions, but he looks to your hearts. And in Rumi, it's being translated into Persian and sort of put as a sort of first-person speech in the mouth of God. And the terminology down here as well, nazire qalbi, we are sort of the observers of hearts or the considerers of hearts, is again echoing this Arabic terminology, right? La yandaru, and then qalubikum, your hearts. Yandaru ila qalubikum. Also, I think this this line here that I've given a terminology to everyone. It always reminds me of this Quranic verse 14:4. We have not sent a messenger except in the language of his people. And what's sort of interesting about that is immediately following this verse come a series of verses about Moses, right? Who of course is the protagonist of the Moses and the shepherd story. So it's almost as if Rumi is telling this story about Moses, and perhaps subconsciously in his mind, because of course he knew the Quran very well, that brings to mind this particular theme, right? Of giving a terminology or a language to everyone through prophecy. Now, as the God's speech continues, and his rebuke of Moses continues, he continues to make his point that one should give the shepherd a bit of grace, and he continues to do so using, I would say, a very Islamic kind of logic. So he says, Musia adaban, Musia adab danan digaran, sukhte jan o ravanan digaran. عاشقان را هر نفس سوزیدنی است بر ده ویران خراج و گوش نیست گر خطا گوید او را خاطی مگو گر بود پرخون شهید او را مشو خون شهیدان را ز آب اولتر است این خطار از صد سوام اولتر است در درون کعبه رسم قبله نیست چه قمر قواس را پاچیله نیست تو ز سرمستان قلاووزی مجو جام چاکان را چه فرمایی رفو ملت عشق از همه دینها جداست عاشقان را ملت و مذهب خداست. So Moses, those who know decorum are one group, those with burnt livers and hearts are another. Every breath for lovers is burning, and there is no land tax or tithe on a ruined village. If they speak sinfully, do not call them sinners. And if a martyr is covered in blood, do not wash him. For martyr's blood is higher than water, and this sin is better than 100 good deeds. Inside the Kaaba, one need not find the Qibla. What harm if the pearl diver has no shoes? Don't seek your guide from among the drunks. Why demand mending from those who tear their shirts? The community of love is apart from all religions. God is community and religion for lovers. So again, this final line really does accord very well with this notion of mysticism as a kind of super-religious individual orientation towards God, right? That is apart from religion. I mean, that's what it seems to be saying. And that's partly why I think this line is so popular. But if we look at it in context, I think God is making, I would say, a very sort of Islamic case for understanding the shepherd as a sort of privileged kind of individual that Islam makes room for, who, due to his love of God, shouldn't be held to the same kinds of standards of other people. He's not saying that sort of all religions are equal or that the Sharia is abrogated or anything like that. So first of all, he uses finer points of Islamic law. He says there is no land tax or tithe on a ruined village, right? Ush and kharaj, these are sort of technical taxes in Islamic taxation. And they're not, according to the jurisprudence, you can't levy them on a village that's ruined or a wasteland. And so God is saying, the shepherd's heart is so burnt, it's like a burnt area, suffered a fire, and you can't tax it, right? You can't tax it by making it accord with these sort of niceties of finer theological points. If a martyr is covered in blood, do not wash him. Of course, blood is najas. It's polluting in Islam. Blood should be washed from a corpse before it's buried, unless that person is a martyr, right? Unless they've made the ultimate sacrifice on the path of God, and in that case, that sin actually becomes a good deed, right? And so, in the same way that the shepherd, his passion for God is so much that he doesn't speak according to the kind of adab that one would expect and is required in other cases, but because of his sort of burnt heart, that's okay in his case. And I really love this image, right? Inside the Kaaba, one need not find the Qibla. So the Qibla, of course, is the direction of prayer. Muslims are supposed to pray towards the Kaaba. But if you're inside the Kaaba, you can pray any direction, right? And again, I think it really encapsulates it well. This is not about sort of saying the Sharia is abrogated or it's not important how one speaks or the outer form of religion isn't important, but that in the Kaaba, those rules change. And in fact, the reason one can face any direction in the Kaaba is because of the sort of strictures of facing the Qibla, right? It's because you're supposed to face the Kaaba that if you're actually in it, you can pray in any direction, right? So I see what is being made here as a sort of argument, a sort of Islamic argument for saying there's special kinds of people that Islam makes room for that don't necessarily have to follow or shouldn't be expected to follow all the sort of strictures or the niceties of theological formulation. Islam provides for a sort of opening into a sort of transcendent experience of God that transcends externalities, but it's not saying that sort of all religions are one or those outer externalities don't matter in any case. And this certainly the sort of Islamicizing language is of course also evident in the third act we talked about. So after Moses is rebuked, he goes and apologizes to the shepherd. And this is what the shepherd says. He says, "Oh, Moses, I've gone beyond all that. I'm now drenched in heart blood. I have moved beyond the low tree of the furthest limit, Sidrat al-Muntaha. I have gone beyond that direction for 100,000 years. You struck your whip and my horse started from its way. It made a leap and passed the sphere. May the divine accompany our earthly being. Blessings upon your hand and arm. My state is now outside of speech. What am I saying? It is not even my state." So the shepherd has entered into this sort of ineffable, unarticulatable state because of Moses's rebuke. And he can't even talk about sort of personally possessing it anymore. His sort of notion of his own being has been dissolved. But this is still being articulated in a very Islamic way. It's being sort of brought on by following in the footsteps of the prophet. So the shepherd is alluding here to the Mi'raj, or the celestial ascent of the prophet. It's not described in the Quran directly. There's a few sort of mysterious references to things like the Sidrat al-Muntaha, or the low tree of the furthest limit, in a few different surahs. And these different references to these different sorts of mysterious things are then later on strung together into a narrative of the prophet's journey through the spheres to meet and speak with God, actually. And that becomes a way a sort of paradigm for Sufis to talk about their own spiritual, mystical experiences, and also the sort of path of Sufi spiritual progression altogether. So the shepherd here is saying, when you rebuked me, it actually was the push I needed to sort of move further on this sort of spiritual ascent, this spiritual progression. And that's what's brought me up into this ineffable state. But the way he got there is sort of literally by following in the footsteps of the prophet, right? And it's hard to think of something sort of more Islamic than that, I would say. Now, I do want to just very briefly mention that sometimes this third climactic episode is translated. There's a tendency, not in all translations, but in a lot of translations, to sort of remove Islamic terminology from Rumi. And this has been discussed by people like Rosina Ali and Carl Ernst and Omid Safi. What I just wanted to say is that it's not always just an issue of sort of removing Islamic sort of references or a kind of Eastern flavor or something like that, but also making the poem align with this more universalizing notion of mysticism, right? And more focused on a sort of supra-religious mystical encounter with God and less about a kind of Islamic opening onto transcendence. So here's just a few lines from Karl Barks's translation, which is probably the most widely read in Anglo contexts, English-speaking contexts. And he writes, this is from God's rebuke of Moses. So it's right here. He writes, ways of worshiping are not to be ranked as better or worse than one another. Hindus do Hindu things. The Dravidian Muslims in India do what they do. It's all praise and it's all right. And this ways of worshiping are not to be ranked as better or worse than one another. It really is not in the Persian at all. There is a reference to praise in this line here, but it's more about how people are purified by their own praise of God, and God himself is not getting any benefit from their praise. And this line that Hindus do Hindu things and the Dravidian Muslims in India do what they do, it's a sort of recognizable form of the first two baits. Hinduvon ra istilahi Hindmat, Sindhion ra istilahi Sindmat. But that would be sort of more accurately translated as the Indians, for the Indians, the terminology of India is praise, and for the Sindhis, the terminology of Sindh is praise. And this Hind-Sind binary, I think, for Rumi is much more about sort of linguistic and ethnic difference more than like sectarian difference, right? He's definitely not saying sort of Muslims and non-Muslims are on the same level. That's something that's been changed to sort of make Rumi more in this mold of a sort of supra-religious mystic. And if there's any doubt about that, we can also listen to what Rumi himself says. And this is the last slide I have for you. So Rumi, like many writers of Masnavis, he provides sort of commentary and explanation and discussion of his own stories. And this is something that sometimes doesn't sort of accord well with modern literary expectations. This is a discussion for another day. But of course, I think we've all heard the old saw that you should show rather than tell. But Rumi does a lot of telling, actually. And so these things sometimes get excised from translations as well. You'll see a lot of collections of stories from the Masnavi that remove all this kind of commentary. But I think it's actually very important. And we don't necessarily need to accept what Rumi says about his own stories. Sometimes he's not the best interpreter of his own stories, but I think we should at least read them and consider them and think about them. And after all, they're part of the text as well. So this is how Rumi interprets the story of Moses and the shepherd. He says, take heed whether you praise or give thanks. Consider your speech like the prattling of that shepherd. Although your praise relative to his is better, relative to God, it is even worse. How much will you talk? When you look beneath the cover, what you have said is not what you thought it was. If your zikr is accepted, it is a mercy. Like the ritual prayer of a woman bleeding between periods, it is a dispensation. Her prayer is tainted by blood, and your zikr is contaminated with anthropomorphism and how. So, just a couple things I want to point out. One is that the Rumi, as sort of narrator and commentator and authorial voice really here, calls the speech of the shepherd nafarjam, or kind of prattling. And he does this at other points in the narrative too. He calls it a bihude goftan, sort of saying useless things. So he speaks of what the shepherd says actually in fairly harsh terms himself, as things that don't really make sense, things that are not proper. And he says, although your praise relative to his is better, right, relative to God, it is even worse. So he's constructing hierarchies here, right? He's constructing hierarchies here. So it's not that sort of any way you want to talk about God is fine. It's not that ways of worshiping are not to be ranked as better or worse than one another. Or it's all praise and it's all right. On the contrary, none of it is right. None of it is as good as God, and some of it is less right than others, right? His point seems to be that anthropomorphism is bad, right? Your zik is contaminated with anthropomorphism, and the anthropomorphism of the shepherd is also problematic. But the issue is that, the shepherd's anthropomorphism at least is sincerely spoken, and some of us who might criticize the shepherd for being sort of simplistic and naive, we have a kind of hidden anthropomorphism that is buried deep within us that maybe we're covering up or we're not even aware of, and that is even worse, right? The sort of hypocritical anthropomorphism that we might have. Very clear hierarchies are being constructed here. There's this idea that the shepherd is not exactly a model to emulate, but that in Rumi's mind, it's not so much sort of celebrating the shepherd's naive love of God, but rather using him and the story as a call to be vigilant about our own sort of hidden anthropomorphism that might be even worse. Right? That might be even worse. I'm going to end there. I hope that this has been interesting for you all, and you've learned something about sort of Rumi and something about the tendencies we have when we translate him and what gets changed and what gets left off and why. And I would suggest that when you read Rumi or read translations, actually not just Rumi, anything, it can be really productive to actually read those translations against maybe more sort of more literal translations and think about why they've been changed and how. If you read the Persian, you can do it with the Persian. Maybe just a few lines, think about, why is this being changed this way or that way? If you don't read Persian, you can read multiple translations and try to sort of triangulate amongst them. I think it's a really useful exercise because it helps you not just sort of understand Rumi better, but also our own kind of expectations of this age that we bring to the text. And it makes those expectations apparent in a way that for me at least gives me even more appreciation of the original and helps me learn something about myself, sort of assumptions and expectations that I might not even know I have. So that's it. I look forward to hearing what you all think, to what Fran thinks, and to any questions from the audience as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Austin, for your talk. I'm excited to hear Francesca Chubb-Confer's response. We have maybe about 10 minutes for questions and discussions among the two of you, and then we have a couple of minutes also for audience questions. So if you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A box, and then we will answer it, hopefully, if we have time. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Francesca, please go ahead.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Austin. A marvelous, marvelous talk. And we were talking earlier, I was just saying that as someone who is teaching Rumi in an undergraduate class on Sufism, like this semester, I was like, it's just too bad that this talk came after I had sort of already gone through some of these things, and I'll have to consolidate some of your insights on this, and and thinking about how to teach it for next time around. I have yes, I was like, I have many questions. It's like wonderfully productive talk, and like this particular story, right? It's such a rich text. I wanted to think more just with everyone about like just the importance of this idea that the mode of expression matters, right? That, as you said at the end, it's like, yeah, actually there are better and worse ways, right? Of talking to God. And I was thinking about this in terms of another part of the kind of like sort of Western scholarship on mysticism, often tends to have this idea of like privileging kind of the idea over the form, right? To the extent that like often, in Sufism as well, even though of course like so much of it is expressed in, literary and poetic genres, that like an idea of sort of the literary is also divorced from an idea of like what sort of the true Sufism may be, right? Whether that's like theological or philosophical or something else. And I found it very interesting that, right, that it's not only, of course, that Rumi is like making this argument that the sort of the medium of expression is like crucial to how the experience is being understood and like rendered understandable to others, but also, of course, that he's doing this like in poetry, right, rather than philosophical prose or what have you, right, in a very particular kind of like narrative poetry, which serves as sort of didactic function. Yeah, I guess that's one of and then the other thing that sort of occurred to me, which in tying that to the references that he's making, right, to the Quran, and like the verse that you mentioned, right, about this Quranic notion of like having sent to every messenger, right, in a sort of region's or like a community's own language. It's interesting because it's just like, yes, right, that line, yes, we have not sent a messenger, right, except in the language of his people. But of course, like the Quran is the last one, right, and like the best one, and kind of like supersedes the previous ones, right, in its own logic, which ties into this whole idea of, right, the sort of inimitability of the Quran in Arabic. So it's also kind of staking like a particular theological claim, for Islam, right, as the best mode of expression as well, right, as opposed to even those that came, sort of informed it, like the Torah or the Gospel. Yeah. So there's a lot of thoughts, but
Yeah,
yes.
no, thanks. I think that's all super interesting. And thanks for those. Let me see. I was gonna say, yeah, certainly the sort of the sort of modern kind of notions of mysticism really privileges like that sort of inner orientation more than the exterior form. And I do want to say that I think, part of the reason Rumi appeals to it is because he also says that, right? Like, there's the ma'ani versus the surat, right? And he says over and over again that it's, that the ma'ani is somehow more important than the surat, although somehow they're linked, right? Or the the mani is like the depths of the ocean, and the surat is like the calf on its surface, right? So I think that's why he appeals to people coming from this, who are invested in this sort of modern notion of mysticism, and why it's so easy to read him in along with it. The thing is, though, and that's sort of what I was trying to show with this talk, is I don't think he's saying that, externalities don't matter at all, right? They do. They do matter. And so, of course, there's this, other Sufis do this too, but I always think of Rumi. When I think about it, you have sort of the Shariat, right? And then the Tariqat, and then the Haqiqat, right? So the Shariat is like the Sharia, sort of exoteric Islam and the practice of the law. And then the Haqiqat is, the Tariqat is sort of the practice of Sufism or the way or something. And the Haqiqat is like the truth, And then it can be understood in lots of different ways. I think he says, like the Shariat is like the practice of knowing knowledge of medicine or something, medical knowledge, and that tariqat is like applying it, and the haqiqat is like the actual state of having health, right? He uses these kinds of explanations. And so that inner core is sort of the most important thing. But you can't have it without the others, right? You can't have the state of health if you don't have the application of medical knowledge and then the medical knowledge to apply. And I think he's really insistent on that. And that's why I love the sort of the line about the no qibla inside the Kaaba, right? Because I think it sort of nicely shows how he is interested in this sort of notion of sort of transcendence, and there's a point at which externalities don't matter, but you sort of get there through Islam, right? And he's interested in a sort of Islam beyond Islam, if anything. I don't think it's a sort of ecumenical world beyond religion. I think it's a sort of transcendent Islam that he's into. But that's why, I think that's why he's easy to read and from a historical sense, maybe misread. But I also want to say, if people find meaning in that, I'm not necessarily opposed to it. But I think it's important to keep things living and make them apply to people's own, people have a spiritually productive use for Rumi that they want to put him to. That's not the historical. I mean, that's fine. But I think one, also needs to sort of be aware of what one's doing and sort of respectful of the source text. And sometimes people are very much, and sometimes not so much, and sometimes as a historian, or as a sort of literary scholar, sort of historically minded, sometimes I feel bad for Rumi that I don't think, all of his texts really get read very carefully, even though a lot of people have a lot of ideas about them.
And I'd say the benefit of I think sort of the benefit of it is sort of the sort of reading that you're showing us is getting, adding to the sort of the complexity of questions like the one that, sort of like Shahab Ahmed uses to frame the, the What is Islam tome, right? Where it's like, how do we understand as Islamic precisely that which, seems to be un-Islamic, right? Or seems to violate kind of core tenets in one way or another, right? Sort of many of which we see in Sufi discourse, right? With the kind of language of wine drinking or infidelity, all of these kinds of things, where, on the one hand, of course, you could do, right, what things sort of translators do with something like this, where you do sort of, you go for the, a universal claim that is nonetheless kind of smuggling in a particular Protestant conception of religion. But, the reality of it is just a sort of a much more complicated relationship between experience and metaphor, right? Between what, how is it that you achieve that transcendent state in a particular way?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and his book, it was very important to this article. I mean, I sort of in this talk, I cited several times. So that's a good one. I wanted to say something about, oh yes, you mentioned form, right? And teaching, and right, he's teaching in Persian, and that's absolutely right. One of the interesting things about how Rumi's received now is the ways in which, Rumi himself even sort of says this at the beginning of the Masnavi, that everyone has a different way to understand me, right? He's speaking as the sort of the reed flute, but none of them really get it. And I feel like that's sort of the case. There's so many different ways people understand him. So I can just tell a sort of personal story about this. When I was a student, I went to Istanbul for a conference, and then I went to Konya with some friends, and we grad student friends, and we went to see the Mevlevi shrine there and Rumi's grave. And I was expecting, my own, for Rumi, I studied poetry, right? So I know him as a poet, and I was expecting, I don't know, I thought I thought I'd be able to buy his divan or something on the street there, and everyone would be reciting his poetry. But if you go to Konya, he's really a saintly figure, right? Like people make pilgrimage to get some, sort of to visit this holy person and be close to him, and they find meaning in that. And he really wasn't seen as or celebrated as a poet really in Konya. It was really his status as like a saint that one can do a sort of ziyarat to his tomb. And yeah, so I was also like, I thought, wow, how how different is my understanding of him than sort of so many other people's, in Turkey, for instance. And that's also interesting too, that sort of his life as a miracle worker, as the founder of a tariqa. That's often not part of how he's known in sort of English speaking sort of circles as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I have another question, but I don't know if we want to turn it to the audience.
Yeah, perhaps. Actually, I'm going to abuse my position as moderator and ask a question of my own before we turn to an audience question. So I really enjoyed your discussion of mysticism as this kind of Protestant notion of a personal connection to God, but also this supra-religious construct that gained popularity in 18th, 19th century. And that shapes, our reception of Rumi still today. And I was wondering, what would change if instead of the term mysticism, you look at the term Irfan? Like what historical connotations does that term have, and does it work similarly with similar results? Like, because we're talking about Ha'ari's fieldwork and how the story gets truncated there too, or I'm sure that it has a different history
Right.
as a concept, but how different is it from mysticism?
That's a really good question, and I don't feel totally qualified to provide an answer. But what struck me, I guess, is how this sort of truncation is not just in English, right? And it's not just when it's presented to Westerners. I'm not like super active on like YouTube or social media to know how it's being, and I don't live in Iran, right? So I don't know exactly how it's being talked about. But my impression from both like Hari's book and other people I've talked to is that, in Iran, some people will criticize this story as being like an example of Rumi saying that, that, religion's difference doesn't matter, right? And what struck me is that, so even in, Persian speaking contexts, people seem to be operating in this framework that has a sort of super religious understanding of Rumi's mysticism that I don't think is borne out by the text, and people also there seem to not be reading what I consider the most important part of it. So that's why, and I included that in because I think it's kind of a global thing, it's not just a, Western thing. It's sort of a global way of thinking about it. Now, is the idea of thinking about Irfan, which of course was not really category when Rumi was writing, that he, and he'll use that word, but Irfan sort of becomes a thing, right, in the sort of Safavid period, that is seen as somehow different than Sufism. In some of the ways that it's been suggested as different than Sufism. It has a more kind of theoretical and maybe more sort of individual kind of connotation, with less emphasis on sort of Sufi orders. And this has to do with Safavid politics, and people like Atta Anzali have written about this. So this is not a clear answer to the question, but yeah, maybe if we I guess I would say it seems to me that this is a global phenomenon, right? As a sort of move to a sort of universalizing mysticism, but the role of sort of Erfan as a category may have some specific work in there in a Persian-speaking context that would be interesting to tease out.
Mm-hmm. For sure, yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I think I would like to turn to our audience question, which is incidentally not related to Rumi at all. But the person asking thanks you for an amazing presentation and a very complete analysis. And the question is slightly off topic, but you made a comment in your presentation about Khayyam and that you advise against considering his work Sufi. And the person would love to, if you could elaborate briefly.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
So, well, I just don't see this. Well, Khayyam is a big can of worms, right? Because in fact, it's very difficult to say if he actually, the poems we now know as Khayyamian quatrains were in fact written by Khayyam at all. They don't appear till a bit later, and they have a tendency to grow and grow and grow as time goes on. More and more poems are attributed to his name, many of which are also attributed to Rumi or Attar or people in other contexts. But among those quatrains that are seen as most likely to be authentic, we just don't see very many Sufi themes at all. And what we know from his life, he was sort of a Abyssinian philosopher and mathematician, and there's just not really any indication that he was particularly interested in Sufism. However, the quatrains were read by people who understood them as Sufistic within the Persian tradition and without. So it does seem that people were sort of reading them and giving them Sufi interpretations, at least in the 19th, 18th, 19th century. And certainly when they were translated into English, so Fitzgerald does his translation, and he is adamant that they're sort of not mystical. And his introduction, I always talk, Khayyam could be part of this conversation because the way he's received in English is really, really interesting. And in his introduction to his translation of the quatrains, Fitzgerald says something like, he presents Khayyam as sort of a truth teller, and that he says the Sufis have many similar themes in their poems, but they're not honest enough to say it straight. Basically, he says he presents Sufis as being probably they're sort of materialists at heart, but they're sort of too scared to admit it. They don't have the bravery. Neither does Hafez. But he says Khayyam is definitely not, a Sufi. He's not engaging in any of that obfuscation, and he's into sort of wine and, in vino veritas, and sort of grab the moment, seize the day, and live while you can. But other people, there was a translation by someone named Nicolas into French around the same time as Fitzgerald, and he sees them as entirely Sufi, and he writes, in parentheses, when he talks about wine, he means, la divinité or Dieu. And Fitzgerald, in his second translation, has a little dig at Nicolas. That is a very sort of colonialist dig and Orientalist dig, where he says, well, I think that Nicolas must be getting help translating these from a native informant who must be a Sufi and must be contaminating his understanding of them. Yes, anyways, this has gone on long enough. I have a lot to say about Khayyam and his translations, but there's always been, at least in the English translations, a sort of tension between those who see them as Sufi and those who don't. They have certainly been read as Sufi in the Persian tradition. I don't see any evidence from what we know of the life of Khayyam or the most likely quatrains to be attributed to him, all of which should be considered as sort of provisional attribution of any Sufi influence.
Great. Thank you so much for this answer. Maybe that's another talk I can carry on in the future. Okay, I think I would like to wrap up for today. And I thank you all for coming. I see some familiar names. Hello, Pune. Hello, Shahla in the audience. Thanks for coming. I would like to ask you if you have 3 minutes to take our survey and tell us how much you loved our session today. You can scan the QR code on the screen, or the link is in the chat as well, or we can also send it to you by email. We have some other lectures coming up. I think the next one will be on April 12th, if I'm correct, but you'll find our upcoming lectures on our website under the Alireza Ahmadian Lecture series. And I really hope that you will join us again, be it over Zoom or perhaps in person for our next lecture. So thank you very much again for joining us. Thank you to Austin and to Francesca for the contributions today. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you again. We will stay on, Francesca and Austin, for a bit, and we say goodbye to the audience members. Thank you.
Thank you.